I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV-MC. Today we're going to show you how to rebuild the top end on your Sherco SE300 or SE250. It's going to be a similar process in either case, and Sherco recommends replacing your piston at 40 hours for competition use. Or another way to keep track of that maintenance is do a compression test during your routine maintenance. Once that compression number starts to drop, then you're going to want to get in there and replace your piston. It's simple to do, so let's get started. For parts, you're going to need a piston kit that comes with your piston, wrist pin, circlips, the rings. You're going to find the needle bearing separate, and then we also have a gasket kit. This one's from Cometic, and it's going to come with all the O-rings, crush washers, the gaskets. Now we will be checking our squish, so we have multiple base gaskets to choose from. To do this job, we're going to need some safety glasses, rubber gloves, rags. We've got some common hand tools, including sockets, combo wrenches. We've got pliers, spring puller. We're also using some feeler gauges, screwdrivers, Allen sockets, a torque wrench, and for consumables, we've got our coolant, contact cleaner, assembly lube, and some high temp silicone sealant. You want to start out with a clean bike. We've gone ahead and washed ours. We also removed our seat, our gas tank. I cleaned the air filter, so we have a fresh one to put back in it, and I've also drained our coolant. So the next step for us is to remove our exhaust. Next, we're going to remove both radiators, so we need to loosen up the hose clamps, then we'll remove the louvers and the mounting bolts. To prevent anything getting into the radiator hose, we're going to block it off with a paper towel. We also have a fan we're going to disconnect on the other side. Then we can loosen up the clamp on the head and remove that hose. Next, we're going to disconnect 2 ground wires off the engine hanger. Then you can remove the hanger bolts and hangers. Make sure you loosen up the nut side of those bolts. Then we'll move the additional CDI out of the way and then disconnect the temperature sensor. Next, we'll remove our spark plug, our valve motor cover, and the valve motor. Next, we're going to crack loose the cylinder head bolts in a crisscross pattern, and then remove our cylinder head. Now you'll notice that when I remove this head, that we had one of the O-rings stick to it. You also won't need to pay attention to the 2 little dowel pins right here. So one came with the head, one's in there. Just make sure you don't drop those down in the cylinder. Next, we're going to remove the power valve cover on the right side of the cylinder, and then we can loosen up the cylinder base nuts in a crisscross pattern. Once those are off, we're going to remove our plug cover for the left side of the crankshaft, and then we're going to use a 17mm socket to turn the motor over, and we're going to get the piston at the lowest point, so it's a little bit easier to remove this cylinder. So now we can remove the cylinder. If this thing is stubborn, you can lightly tap on it with a soft face mallet. And as you remove the cylinder, just keep a hand on this piston. Don't let it slam against the case. And then you'll notice I rotated that cylinder to the left side of the bike to help it come out of the frame. And we can finish removing that cylinder base gasket. Now we can rotate the piston to its highest point, and we're going to place a rag underneath it. To remove the circlip, we're just using some small needle nose pliers. Grab onto that and then twist it out. And I've got my 11mm socket. I'm going to press from the other side and push that piston pin out. If that doesn't work, you're going to have to use a piston pin puller. So we'll remove the piston and the needle bearing. Now I do want to mention those 2 dowel pins. You want to pay attention to those. And from here, it's just cleaning and inspecting. So we're going to wipe the small end of the connecting rod. And while we're there, You can run your fingernail across there and see if there's any grooves or damage to that. If there is, you need to rebuild the bottom end. After that, we're going to clean up the base gasket sealing surface. So we've got our gasket scraper, and just be careful that you don't get anything down into these holes right here. And you also want to make sure those studs are clean. Next, we're going to remove the rags from around our connecting rod. We're going to make sure we didn't get any gasket material down in here. Make sure there's no dirt as well. Now we're going to rotate the crank 1 revolution. You want to make sure that it rotates smoothly. If it feels rough, then you probably have some issues with your crank bearings. The next step is we're going to check for play in the connecting rod big end. So just to help us a little bit, I'm going to spray off the big end with some contact cleaner. That way we don't have oil padding any play. I'm going to pull straight up and down on this. If you feel any play straight up and down, then you need to get in here and get that rebuilt. Don't get that confused with side-to-side play. There is going to be a little bit of play side to side, and you can actually measure that, and that's also an indicator of wear. The spec is 0.8 to 1 millimeters. If you're over 1.25, then you definitely need to get in there and get this rebuilt. And the other thing you might feel is play in the crank bearings. So if you notice you have play in there, again, go into your bottom end and make any repairs that you need to. We're also going to inspect the reed valve while we're here. So if you look down in here, you can see the reed pedals. You just want to make sure they're not broken or cracked or damaged in any way, and that they're not hanging open. And once you have everything inspected, you just want to put those rags back in place. Now over at the bench, we need to clean and inspect some of our parts. So the cylinder head sealing surfaces, you need to make sure those are clean. And then underneath, we're going to use our gasket scraper for that base gasket sealing surface, get that cleaned up. And then we're going to take a look at our Nicosil. So this is going to be a little easier for us because we're just replacing a piston due to normal wear. But if you had any issues like overheating or a complete failure, you're definitely going to want to look at your manual for more in-depth inspections. Now when you're cleaning this stuff off, a maroon Scotch-Brite pad can help you out. And then at a very minimum, you want to spray everything off with contact cleaner and use some compressed air. Make sure you blow out all the passageways. And then once you've done that, you want to check this Nicosil coating. You're mainly doing a visual inspection. So you want to make sure there's no score marks, pitting or flaking, and ideally you're going to have a crosshatch pattern going down in there. If you don't see that, or if you have any questions about inspecting this, you're going to want to check out our How to Inspect Nicosil Cylinders video. For us, we're going to keep going deeper with this. We're also going to be taking everything apart and cleaning that carbon off. So if you want to know how to do that, follow us over to the power valve video. And then once we jump back in, we're going to start with reassembly. So we've got all of our parts cleaned up. And again, we cleaned out our power valve. If you need to know how to do that, click right here. Now, from here, what we need to do is check the ring end gap. Sometimes you won't have to change this, sometimes you will, but you want to make sure it's correct. So we'll install the ring into the cylinder, and we're going to push it down about 10 millimeters. Make sure it's square in the bore. And the gap spec is 0.35 to 0.45 millimeters. So this gap's measuring right at 0.35 millimeters. If you find that your gap is too small, you can use a file to open that up. Then we can do that same check on our other ring. Now that we've checked the ring end gaps, we're going to start with assembly. So we had one of the dowel pins out of our cylinder. I need to put that in. Set that to the side. So on the piston, you'll notice there's an arrow that's going to face towards the exhaust. We need to install one of the circlips into the piston right now. So we're going to do it on the side of the piston that will be on the right side of the bike. So I'm going to place that wrist pin in the piston. And that's just going to make sure that I don't push this in too far and scratch the bore. And you want the open end of the gap that needs to be at 12 or the 6 o'clock position on the piston. We've got our gap at the 6 o'clock position, and we've made sure that the clip is all the way in. Super important to do. Now we can remove that wrist pin. To install the piston onto the bike, you want to lube up your connecting rod, the needle bearing, wrist pin, and the wrist pin bosses. Now we can set the piston in place. Keep in mind the arrow will face the exhaust side. Then slide the wrist pin through and install your circlip. After that, we can remove the rags from around the piston. And since we sprayed that big end of the connecting rod off, I'm going to apply some lube to it. And then I'm going to rotate the engine so the piston is at its lowest point. When you're rebuilding your top end, there's going to be several different sizes of base gaskets available. So you want to make sure you get the correct one in there. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to start with a 0.5 millimeter base gasket and set it in place. Next, we're going to install the cylinder, and we don't have the rings on our piston yet since we're going to take the cylinder right back off. And we're going to torque the cylinder base nuts in a couple steps. First 20 Newton meters and then take them up to 35 Newton meters. And once you've done that, you can go ahead and rotate the piston to its highest point. Now we're going to set our straight edge right above our wrist pin. And that's because the piston can actually rock back and forth. So the center is going to be the accurate point to measure. So I'm just going to roll this back and forth and make sure I'm at the highest point. And if you want to get really technical, you can use a dial indicator to verify that. And when you slide your feeler gauge underneath that straight edge, you want to choose the feeler gauge that just has a slight drag to it. So in our case, that's 0.08 millimeters. Now, if you didn't measure any clearance here, that means you have a positive deck height, then you're definitely going to need to adjust it. So you could set this on top of the piston and then measure out to the cylinder and see what that clearance is. Now with this measurement, it doesn't hurt to check it a couple times. Just because we're not using a dial indicator, you need to make sure this is accurate and you're getting the same reading every time. So if we look at our manual, we're going to start by using the numbers on the left column. Since we're measuring from the top of the cylinder down to our piston, that measurement is actually a negative number. So we're negative 0.08 millimeters, and that actually falls right in spec for the 1.7 millimeter squish, which means we actually have the correct gasket. But if you measured, let's say you're negative 0.16 millimeters, then you're actually going to have to tighten up your squish bend. So what you're going to do is use a thinner base gasket. You can just compare those numbers to the chart. So if you measured 0.16, then you'd use that 0.4 millimeter base gasket, and that should bring you into the 1.7 millimeter squish range. On the other hand, if your measurement was bigger or greater than negative 0.05 millimeters, you're going to need a thicker base gasket, and that way it's going to loosen up that squish bend and get you in the correct range. Again, just use the chart. That's going to help guide you. If you need to double stack base gaskets, that's going to be just fine. So what we've shown you is all you really have to do, but if you want to verify your squish, what you can do is use a piece of solder, cut it just like we have. You're going to file the ends flat, and then you want a little loop in it so you can adjust it so it contacts all the way to the cylinder wall across the same direction as your wrist pin is going to the other cylinder wall. So I'm going to go ahead and adjust that. You need to make sure the loop isn't big enough that it's actually going to hit on that squish band as well. That's why we have that small loop in there. I'm going to dab a little bit of grease on there just to hold it in place so it's not moving around in there. You want to make sure the piston is about 10 millimeters before top dead center, and then we're going to install the cylinder head, and we're not going to install the O-rings at this time just because they're going to get squished down anyway and they're not going to change our reading. After that, you can install the cylinder head bolts. We're going to torque those in a crisscross pattern to 25 Newton meters. From the left side of the bike, rotate the engine counterclockwise just past top dead center, and then you can remove the cylinder head. Now we can remove the solder, and you're going to measure this on each side as far out on the end as you can. If you get different measurements from side to side, what you're going to do is find the average. So add those together, then divide by 2. With ours, you can see that we measured right in spec with our current base gasket. Now we're confident that our bike is going to run at peak performance when we go back together. The next step is to install our piston rings. You'll notice on the rings that there's a mark, and those are going to face up. Then we're going to install the piston rings with the end gaps lining up with the pin in the ring grooves. After that, we're going to lube the piston rings and the piston. Make sure your gasket surface is clean, and then we'll install that gasket that you chose when you did your deck height. Now you also want to make sure there's lube in your cylinder. And then to set this in place, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the cylinder sideways and squeeze those rings together. So this has the bigger flange that's going to be on the left side of the bike on the cylinder. And then I'm going to press the rings against those pins in the ring grooves and then compress the other side, and the cylinder should slide right on. Now you're going to have to rotate it so the cylinder is in the correct orientation. And when you do that, you need to make sure that those piston rings stay compressed and don't come out of the grooves while you rotate the cylinder. So we're good there. We're going to press down on the cylinder and make sure we're centered on the dowel pins and have this pressed down all the way. After that, we're going to install the cylinder base nuts. We're going to tighten them in a crisscross pattern, and then your final torque on that is going to be 35 Newton meters. After that, we're going to rotate the engine over and make sure everything rotates freely and smooth, which ours does. So we need to put our piston at top dead center, and then we're just going to wipe away any extra assembly lube. Next, install the 2 O-rings for the cylinder head. You're going to make sure that the 2 dowel pins are in place. Install the cylinder head and then the 6 bolts with the new copper washers, and you're going to tighten those down in a crisscross pattern. Do this in a few steps and do the final torque to 25 Newton meters. Install your new spark plug. Install the engine plug. Next, we're going to install the valve motor. Now you want to make sure that groove is lined up with your pin. And once you have everything back together, it's a good idea to take this to your Sherco dealer and make sure that this motor is calibrated correctly. On the right side of the bike, reconnect the power valve hose, and then we're going to install the cover with a new gasket. After that, we'll install the radiator hose and the radiators. Install the spark plug cap, the coolant temp sensor. Next, we'll install the additional CDI and hanger brackets. And we're going to torque these nuts to 23 Newton meters. Reconnect the 2 ground wires. Fill the bike with coolant. Don't forget your bleeder on the other side. After that, we'll reinstall the pipe. I also have a little bit of silicone around those O-rings. From here, we just need to reinstall our gas tank, our seat, and once we've done that, you want to start the bike up, bring it up to operating temperature, and then we're going to shut it down, let it cool down all the way. You're going to check for any leaks and top off your coolant. Now from there, you can just follow the break-in procedure. If you need any of the parts that we used in our top end rebuild today, you can find those on our website. That's all there is to rebuilding your Sherco SE300 or SE250. If you have any questions about the rebuild process, leave those down in the comments below, and make sure you subscribe to our channel for more helpful content. I'm Charles with Rocky Mountain ATV MC. Thanks for watching.